Hi there, and welcome to Be a Global Citizen, the podcast that explores the concept of global citizenship through the lens of value-creating education. My name is Scott Bauer, and I'm a SOCA researcher and educator. I hope you find the discussions, stories, and insights on this podcast to be valuable and inspiring as we strive to become global citizens who are committed to living a contributive life. Enjoy the conversation.
Hi, my name's Colleen Tully. I am based in Hudson Valley, New York, and I am an education advocate for undocumented students and refugee students who are in foster care.
Hi, Colleen. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It's so exciting to have you, and I'm really excited to learn more about the work that you're doing, especially with undocumented. You said undocumented migrants, or it's
I,
mostly for indigenous?
so I work with undocumented and refugee students. Many of my
Okay.
students are from Guatemala, and so they're of Mayan descent and speak Mayan indigenous languages.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, so I'm like very excited to learn more about the kind of work that you do supporting them, as well as how you found yourself doing that work. I'm sure there's a really strong reason that brought you to the work. And yeah, and I think that it's really important to highlight those kind of stories that often are kind of put by the wayside or not properly framed or understood in the context and the light that they deserve. So I'm so happy that you can, on behalf of them, right, given your close work, that you do with them, we can learn more about that together. And so, I like to begin by learning more about your journey, and if you can kind of provide some information with regards to like important events that you've kind of had in your life, both personal and professional. Just kind of take us through to like how you got to the work that you're doing right now.
Absolutely. So I'm myself, I'm indigenous and Latina. I'm Ecuadorian, I'm Quechua, and I'm Cherokee. And some Euro mix thrown in there. But I'm also an adopted child. So growing up, I knew that I was Cherokee and I like clung to that identity. Like one part of myself that I knew for sure that was like all about, that was me. Those were my roots. And so, I mean, throughout my education, I have always drawn and come back to indigenous circles. I was the one kid in the Catholic school who would get in trouble because we talked about history, and I'd be like, wait, that's not accurate. We're still here. And often found myself in a position where I was the only indigenous person in the space. And so like I come back to indigenous communities a lot, no matter kind of how far I stray, I always end up back working with indigenous communities. I also had a hard time learning growing up. Like I tricked people into thinking I could read, basically. I would memorize the books, and then in third grade realized like I wasn't really actually reading. I was just memorizing them. So I had to do like extra tutoring, and I needed a lot of additional academic support. So I was very lucky to be able to receive. So being aware of like different strategies for helping how different students learn is also like a big part of my practice. Um, and then in college, I kind of hopped around a bit, but I ended up studying visual art education, which I think is really important. I focus on like cultural context when we talk about visual arts. So again, I emphasize a lot of different indigenous artists and how indigenous stories and learning are found in art. And so I use that a lot to root lessons in. And at the same time, I was living and working on a dairy farm. And then when I was on the dairy farm, I was like unofficially translating for an older Ecuadorian man who was working on as another farmhand with me. And I was often mediating between him and another farmhand. And so it's very interesting. Like I even being on a farm, I was using my Spanish and my contacts and I was teaching. And then I was in this visual arts classroom teaching and translating and doing multilingual work. And then after I graduated undergrad, I went to the foster care system. I work at the Children's Home of Poughkeepsie, and I was a youth care worker. I started out working with anywhere from infants to, it was like K through 12, infants, preschool, and then I had kids K through 12, um, from all different backgrounds, ethnicities, socioeconomic lives, and who all had a wide range of trauma. And so trauma informed care is a big part of what I believe when we talk about education. I think that that should be a staple of the classroom, cultural context, trauma informed care, um, a way to connect cultural context. So they're like the three big ones for me. Um, and as I went through different positions at this job, there was a time where we had two young youth who were nonverbal. They're about 6 years old, nonverbal, on the spectrum, believe autistic. And so I would utilize sign language because I used to use sign language with a young girl in my church. So I used to do a lot of sign language. So I utilized that and created this whole routine and school structure for them that really wasn't part of my job. But I was like, we need to do something. Like, this is the need here. And so I would do that during the day with them. And then afternoon, when kids came home from school, like they knew that if I was on, we were doing study hall. Like we were doing school. Like Miss Colleen's here, we're having our snack, we're sitting down, we're doing schoolwork. And then my kids that refused to go to school for whatever was going on, because a lot of different ways of responding to trauma, I would do school with them during the day. We'd sit down. I actually took what used to be like a very small closet and I turned it into a classroom. I was able to budget and I, spoke to my supervisor. I was like, we have this need. Here's what we could do. And we were able to make it happen. So we had like a little horseshoe desk and all the different like little tactiles and manipulatives for the kids. So I did that. And those were all like New York State foster care kids. And then we had this opportunity where we expanded our program and under the Bridge of Children's Home, we opened up unaccompanied minors, Nuevas Alas, which means new wings. And so it's right before the pandemic hit, about a year before the pandemic hit. And I was hired to be the lead teacher. And it was really exciting. I got to spend like 6 months just doing research on curriculum development. I learned specifically about SIFE, which is Students with Interrupted Formal Education, which many of my kids coming from Central and South America have. You're in school for a couple years, maybe to third grade, and then you're either working or supporting your family. Um, you might be able to go back for sixth grade, but usually you don't. Um, and because there are other priorities and needs that have to be focused on. So I learned a lot about that population and the context and finding out that many of the students are from Guatemala who speak Mayan dialects. There are 15 different Mayan dialects. So that was like very exciting for me. I love languages. Um, and again, as we're designing this curriculum and school structure, we had the parameters of you need the 5 core subjects. You need math, Spanish literacy, English literacy, a science class, and a history class. But other than that, it was free range. So I was so excited. Like we were doing like art in the classroom. We were doing hands-on science experiments. We were talking about history from the perspective of indigenous peoples, as well as from like the Black perspective, the indigenous perspective, the Latin perspective, so that like we were really weaving in these different voices so that you got a whole picture of like what it meant for like the United States history. So that was very exciting. And then being able to do trauma-informed care in a classroom setting and create a classroom where like we had desks that could be easily moved around to do different groupings. And I ended up networking with over 600 librarians in the States. I sent out one email to one librarian who then like pushed me through to all these other librarians. And I was the coolest email. I was like, I see that your library has indigenous language books. I was looking for Kekchi, and Akateco books. Those are like the 4 biggest dialects that we receive. And they ended up pushing like, well, we can't rent this book to you. It's in our library system, but let me see who we can connect you with. And they sent out this email being like, we have an educator in need of our help. And I went out to 600 librarians all across the country. So I had all these different networks. And there are different organizations that have children's books that are in some of these rare languages. So I was able to budget for like a little library on wheels And we had these beautiful picture books that talked about indigenous culture in indigenous languages with Spanish translations. I was able to talk with a professor who like lived and worked in Guatemala and like has close connections with Guatemalan and Mayan dialect speakers. And so I was able to learn about like the oral components of the culture and like how that's a big part of education and like how can that be translated as a strength into the US education system. Um, so I did that for a couple of years, and then our program expanded further, where we now, in addition to our emergency foster care program for unaccompanied minors, so those are children again immigrating to the U.S. They arrive unaccompanied, and they don't immediately have a family member, so they go to our program. And within, I mean, it's very quick turnaround. The goal is to get them reunified with family as fast as possible. So in there for like a month or so, maybe 3 months max. Our other program, which is LTFC, long-term foster care that I'm in now, same organization, just a different program. It's for students who arrive unaccompanied, but they can't immediately find a sponsor or family member, or their case is more complicated. So they're here longer, and because they're here longer, they're able to enroll in the local school system. So I work as a liaison between the local school district and our foster care organization, which has been a whole journey in and of itself. Um, I want to be mindful. The school we work with, the previous superintendent had a lot of reservations about our population. In the past, the children's home had a reputation for having youth that had behavioral issues, and the school wasn't always equipped to handle that. And so I think there was a lot of assumptions about what context my students would be bringing to the classroom. The majority of my students, like it's very different. Like in Latino culture, you're not gonna act up and throw things. Like you're not doing that. Like you've been very much conditioned, and many of the students have been parentified. So like if they don't want to be in school, it's because they want to be working because like that's what they're used to. Um, they may get frustrated with language barriers, but there's no like visceral reaction that the school was really expecting. There's this assumption that there's going to be a lot of violence now, and having to unpack those internalized bias that were kind of being presented by school leadership was a lot. And trying to provide education about like what these students will need and what they like deserve, what rights they have, and what they deserve to have in the school. And so that was a bit of an uphill battle, trying to work through that. We have a new superintendent now who's incredible, and they just hired a multilingual coordinator who's an absolute angel. And you could tell she's like gonna get stuff done. She's on a roll. So like that's kind of been my whole arc. And still working with indigenous speakers, very big. I have a whole library in my office that's bilingual books, multicultural books. We also have students from Afghanistan, so we talk about Islam and different perspectives from Muslim students as well. Then we do a lot of like cultural sharing between the students because it's a very different life experience from someone coming from Afghanistan and someone coming from Guatemala, and we do a lot of cultural sharing. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at right now. That was long.
No, no, that was wonderful. Thank you so much, Colleen. And it's just so evident how, your story from your upbringing really resonates with the story of all, this population that you're supporting. And I think there's a lot of like through lines in the work that you're doing that are really important to bring up. Like the fact that, indigenous heritage is something very, very important to you, languages, dialects, being able to like, represent one's culture and embrace that culture is very important, to kind of reveal that through some kind of medium like art, the visual arts, I think is also really helpful for students to kind of appreciate that and see beauty in who they are, right? And especially when these students coming from many many different backgrounds, oftentimes there's hardship that follows them within their family dynamic, just trying to you know survive, in some cases, right, based on like kind of where their like the income's coming from, or kind of what the adapting, process is like. Learning languages can be very, very challenging. But that what you mentioned about trauma-informed care is also very interesting, and I would love to learn more about that as well. But before we get into it, I kind of wanted to like kind of rewind a little bit and actually ask a little bit more about these roots of yours, right? Roots in indigenous, like culture as well as Ecuadorian culture. And there's like this great sense of pride that you felt from early on to be indigenous and Latina. So yeah, I'd love to like hear like could you kind of unpack that a little bit more about like what was it about indigenous culture, indigeneity, right? Like how were you able to like embrace that and like can you give like specific examples about what that was like for you growing up, especially since, as you mentioned, you were the only one in most of your classroom settings who was indigenous?
Yeah, I definitely can talk about that. It's a little bit complicated. I feel like I often walk between two different worlds. I was adopted by a white family, Irish Catholics. Though we didn't practice Catholicism, that's a whole other story. But that was the concept of how to incorporate culture was always it's always in twofold. My mom was very big on making sure I knew about my indigenous culture, my indigenous roots. That was like big, like right off the bat. I always had storybooks growing up of multicultural families. Um, we did a lot of research about multicultural work. My mom volunteered a lot in different communities. So like that concept of advocacy was really big for me. Um, at the same time, we didn't really talk about the fact that I was also Latina. I didn't know about that until I was applying to colleges. Um, my parents always said, "Look, we told you everything." I was like, they probably did, but like that wasn't something that we like focused on. And so that was a whole concept. So the indigenous part, I like really like clung to. Like this is my source. These are my roots. I tried to learn Cherokee in middle school. I actually was pretty good, and I haven't spoken in a long time, but I could like write and read a little bit in Cherokee. I had the whole books. I had the cassette tapes because I'm dating myself now, but cassette tapes there. There I would like practice and listen to it. I'm very, and I don't know what your beliefs are, but I'm very, very strong believer in generational knowledge and generational spirit. Like I very much connect with being outside. I connect with I used to listen to certain Lakota music, and it just felt like coming home. I don't know how to explain it. Um, Even like I did Girl Scouts. I was a Go to War Girl Scout, and I did a with my youth group and another youth group in South Dakota. I made this connection with this incredible family, the Looking Elks, and right away it was like, well, you're my granddaughter now. And I remember speaking with them and talking with them, and it was this whole concept of like, okay, well, you need to represent your people. Like whether or not by blood you're Lakota, you're indigenous, and like we're all related, and like you have this opportunity, this privilege to be in a space where you can speak up for voices that aren't able to be heard. And like that's been echoing in my head for a very long time, and then to have that like confirmed, it was very influential. I think I had to learn the hard way about like where and I still sometimes hesitate like where my space is. I'm white passing. And I have a very white name. Colleen Tully is as Irish as it gets. Even though I'm not Irish. And so like I'm very aware of my privilege, but I wasn't always aware of that. And so I think a big part of my journey has been learning, you know, when is it when is it okay to like step back and just hold space? And like sometimes advocacy is opening up the room so that someone can come forward and feel like safe speaking and feel confident speaking. Um, excuse me, sorry.
Bless you.
Versus sorry, thanks. Versus like speaking for someone. I think that's something I had to learn about a lot. But yeah, the indigenous aspect is something that I've just always felt deeply, oh, sorry, deeply connected to. Even in like when we talk about trauma informed care, I mean, everyone has their story, and I won't go too deep into mine, but like I have trauma, I have complex PTSD, and it came out a lot when I was in undergrad in a
Mm.
very visceral way. And so I would do these ceramic classes, and I remember being there doing like two overnights, just like all-nighters in the studio, and I made these little tiny handmade beads because beading's a big part of indigenous cultures in North America. And I did all these tiny little ceramic beads, and then I wove them to try to create this context between like a shoe and moccasins and this I did this whole project, but like it was so therapeutic. Like I was exhausted, but just like making these beads and doing this research about specific artists and the way you can like take traditional art and how it has a place in contemporary times. It's not like a forgotten, you know, forgotten craft. Like it's very important and like an anchor to how people navigate the world today. So that's just interesting to me. Like I always come back to, I mean, even I worked on a farm for a while. I did all over the place, but I still always come back to my roots. I feel very strongly rooted. I spent some time in Arizona for a bit when I was an undergrad, and I met incredible Grace. She's an angel. She's Dene, which is Navajo. And I remember when I saw her, we were in a big crowd and we made eye contact, and it was this moment of like, I know you. Like it was crazy connection of like, and she presents like the stereotypical. She has the long, beautiful two braids, the beautiful beaded earrings, like this kind face. Um, and she and her husband, George, have always been someone that I can reach out to and like who kind of talked me through. I mean, I'm very connected to the spiritual world with it in terms of indigenous studies. And having someone kind of walk you through that was very empowering. And someone that could pick you out of a crowd and be like, "Hey, sister, how are you?" And be like, "Oh, you know me, and I know you." Like I don't know how to explain it, but that's been a part. It's very much a big part of who I am and what I bring to the education table, I guess. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Oh, it definitely does. No, that was beautifully said. I love those specific examples, especially how they tie into art, which is again one of those big through lines that you've been expressing in the work that you do right now. And yeah, and I was just thinking how like while to some people, right, when they look at one's appearance, they kind of make judgments, and they, you know,
Mhm.
you were very clear to be, you know, upfront and saying, oh, I recognize that I might be white passing, but I think, and then you pointed out this other friend who is more of like kind of what we would tend to like associate from just a physical appearance as indigenous. But what you explained in your stories, it's like it's much more like of what you feel and like the
Mhm.
spirit behind the culture, and having that sense like almost inexplicably like connected, you know, that kind of transcends specific tribal affiliations, but this shared struggle or shared trauma, even, right? Knowing the history of these lands here, right, in the continental US, and the way in which that land and culture was very much stripped of these peoples. And yet, you know, you are still here, right? And that holds a lot of power and a lot of hope, I would say, to continuing that tradition and building that sense of, I don't know if it's camaraderie or maybe it's closer like sisterhood or just, you know, or just family, right? That I think has to be just felt from you. I think that's beautiful. So yeah, you spoke about, you know, the identity as being indigenous, but then going to undergrad, you were suddenly kind of discovering that your identity was even more, right? You mentioned
Mhm.
that, you know, your
Yeah.
parents hadn't, you know, focused on that particular aspect of your identity. And so I'm curious if you can maybe speak a little bit about this kind of maybe, you know, tension that you felt between your identities, kind of especially as it expanded, and that, Ecuador now looking to another continent or like going further down south and like into South America, like how did that inform your worldview, and how has that been very helpful to support students coming from places like Guatemala, that perhaps maybe you don't have like direct ancestry to, but yet you still are able to connect with them on such a strong level.
Absolutely. So being adopted on my papers, it just said Spanish and Cherokee. It didn't like specify where. And then when I did a DNA test, it like you can see the visual map and it just circled all of the Americas, North, Central, and South. I was like, okay. So when I was an undergrad, I knew that I was Latina, but I didn't know where from. So I was very big on like I was more hesitant to say Latina because it's a whole complicated. I'm Latina, but I was adopted and I don't know on the paper, like it's a whole thing to unpack. And I ended up I did a lot of Spanish classes because my Spanish at the time wasn't good and I wanted to be able to speak more. I wanted to be able to like communicate more effectively. Um, and I think I ended up doing a study abroad where I lived in Costa Rica for like 6 months, and I loved that. And when I was in Costa Rica, I present Costa Rican. Like I looked exactly like my homestay family. Like everyone thought I was Tica. Like so, then I was like, okay, I must be Costa Rican. I must be a Tica. And the way certain values are structured aligns with like my gut feeling about different structures. It was just it felt like not coming home per se, but it felt very familiar and comforting to be in that cultural context. And so when I look at my students, I'm always very upfront. Like I Spanish is my second language, but I'm indigenous, so like I get the oral traditions. And I always encourage my kids. I'm like, listen, you hear my Spanish, it's okay. You can learn English. Like you're good. I always remind them like, you speak three languages. You speak a rare Mayan dialect. You're speaking Spanish. You're learning English. You're going to school like in an English speaking classroom. Like you are brilliant. And like that perspective is not always presented to the students. There's this concept of like, oh, you're in America, speak English, and like, do you realize how talented these students are? Like how absolutely brilliant they are. Um, so that's a big one for me. And also being mindful of like not fitting a certain group because there is like some indigenous students are shy about being indigenous and they won't really like talk about that. They won't be like talking about being Guatemalan or El Salvadorian, or from Honduras. And so that's always interesting to kind of see the dynamics within different communities because every Latino country is different, different cultures, different identities, but also everyone looks different too. You can be Latina and white passing, you can be Afro Latina, you can be indigenous and Latina, and that's all like mixed together. So it is very interesting, like talking about identity when I talk with my students. Um, I think a big thing I've talked about generational trauma, but trauma is real, and you see it in my students, and like learning how to how to navigate those trauma responses in the classroom is I try to connect it to culture. I think when you have like a foundation that is your culture, that's what you are and that's where you come from, it can provide stability that many students and like for myself, for it didn't have. And so I think that's if you feel stable and safe, then you have the space and capacity to learn and expand your academic opportunities. So that's a big thing as I try to tie those two pieces in together.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Colleen. And I couldn't help but think as you were describing the study abroad experience, right? Going to Costa Rica and feeling this sense that like, oh wow, like I could live here. I would be
Yeah.
embraced, and I feel like I'm at home, right? That
Hmm.
you use this phrase like coming home, in the same way that when you listen to Lakota music, it also felt like you were coming home, and I feel like you know being embraced by others, and then for yourself embracing that as well, like receiving that, I think is really important in this process of transforming one's own trauma, right? To know that like deep down inside, you do belong, right? That is something that we're all searching for. And having that study platform, like you said, is what gives us the, well, it secures us in a way that we can then take risks and kind of going past, our perceived limits that, oh no, I'm not good enough in this area or that area. But you can actually start to like dream, beyond what is your current reality. And I think that's that's so important, especially for those who have been underserved and marginalized and not afforded the same kind of opportunities that others have. So yeah, I love this kind of recurring like sense of coming home, and I actually think that might tie into this topic that I wanted to get more of your thoughts on about global citizenship, because
Yeah.
you're mentioning coming home, and but like you're kind of using art as a way of coming home, or being able to meet with different cultures, learn about different dialects as perhaps another way of coming home. So would you say that that also applies to like your understanding of this notion of being a global citizen? I'm curious, just what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. It's interesting because when I heard the term global citizen, I hadn't heard of it before. I was like a new term to me. But when I was like reading about what it stands for and what it means to be a global citizen, I was like, oh, these are things that are so important to me in my work and that I see at my job. Um, I think being a nonprofit and in foster care, a big part of being a global citizen to me is like empathy, and cultural contact, being informed of different cultural contexts and how they work together. Um, and so when I look at being a global citizen, I think you're not just advocating for vulnerable or underserved communities, it's also like creating a space where their voices can not just come to the table, but feel welcomed and like honored at the table. When you talk about like coming home, if you're in a marginalized community or an underserved community, you're not going to want to come to the table if it doesn't feel like you're welcome there. Like there could be a seat open for you, but if it's a bunch of just like, no offense, but if it's a bunch of like white people sitting at a table, like you're the only BIPOC person, you're not going to feel super comfortable, even if there is a seat for you, you know? So I think global citizenship is like going past that and making more than just making space, like creating an environment where like your voice is valued. Um, And I think as a global citizen, like you have a responsibility to do that. I very much feel I have responsibility, being white passing, but also mixed. I even in like my job, I remember one of the first times I moved from like being a youth care worker into like a coordinator role, hearing someone very well-meaning, but an older white woman say to me like, "Oh, how'd you get in here? Like, you speak Spanish? How'd you get in here?" Because everyone in administrative level, for the most part, was white. And like it's interesting that because I spoke Spanish, all of a sudden the way it was perceived changed. Even like in the way I was interacted changed. And it's very interesting. So like being a global citizen and like wanting to embody advocating for policies and practices that really support a worldview, um, I very much feel that like responsibility of like I need to represent and like I have a responsibility. I have like an ownership to like make sure these voices are heard and that it's not just they're not left behind. I feel that deeply. Um, I don't know if that fully answered your question.
No, it's not about fully answering it or anything. It's more just being like, hey, what are your thoughts at this current moment? And I think, you covered a lot with that response about the importance of empathy, cultural context, and the fact that, there's this responsibility, the weight of responsibility that
Mhm.
you carry, knowing that you are representing many more voices, and that you want to ensure that they have the proper conditions and resources so that they can thrive in an increasingly complex world, right? Just even how you have found your current role, like not found, worked towards, and like kind of like climbed this ladder within the nonprofit space, to then be in a position of more influence. That required a lot of navigating different cultural contexts yourself, and kind of moments of reflection about kind of who you were, and your identities and what you were bringing to the table. And so I feel like the work of fostering global citizens demands that you yourself be one. And
Yeah,
I think that,
absolutely.
yeah, and but the kind of language around it is something that we don't always kind of think about, or it might feel somewhat daunting. I mean, even with your journey, initially thinking of yourself as indigenous, and then the kind of notion of being also Latina and what that meant, it comes with certain baggage, right? But I think this kind of some might think of it as an addition, to that identity. My hope is that it's more of like a kind of like reframing of still inclusive of those identities, but kind of finding ways to, yeah, empower you to like, how emphasize these qualities that you were mentioning about like having that cultural sensitivity about one's place and space, and then also really understanding like this, I'm doing the work for this reason, right? The purpose behind it. um, so I think, yeah, so the interactions with your students, I'm curious, like you said that you have a lot of students who come from Guatemala, and there's like, I didn't know this was like a fun fact, 15 different Mayan dialects. I was like, oh my gosh, such diversity even within this one language. But yeah, are there any like things that you pick up from your students that really inspires you to be like a better educator, or a better global citizen, a better human being? Like, you have so many interactions with them, and so I'm just curious. Like, you've been in this teaching capacity, and have like built the curriculum. But yeah, like, what are certain things that really kind of get you out of bed and inspire you about your students?
My students are some of the most brilliant people I've ever met, and they are so empathetic to their peers. They're so empathetic and kind. I mean, my Spanish comes and goes. Sometimes I'm like on it, I'm passing for fluent, and other times it is Spanglish hardcore. And my kids are so patient with me. And there are some times where I'm like, I don't know how to communicate. Like, it depends on the kids, because I'm like, I've had years where my kids spoke no English, and my Spanish was so, and we're like communicating, we're doing hand signs, we're drawing, we're like looking at pictures on the internet to try to like communicate fully so I can like make sure that I'm understanding. And they're so patient, and they just laugh, and they'll tease me, and I'll tease them back, and it's okay. It's okay to make mistakes and to like work through this together in a fun and loving way. I think there's also that like reality of like my kids have experienced so much. Like, to get from Central America to the United States is a is intense and a trauma. And then they come here, and sometimes they don't want to be in school. Like, if you have this idea of the American dream of like, you come here, you get a job, you can support your family, you can like lift everybody up in your community, and that's not the reality. It's not. Um, but you're still trying. You're still like, I'm going to work through this. I go to school. I have to meet with my lawyer. I have to meet with my case manager. I have to meet with my clinician. I have to do, Office of Refugee has very specific like protocols. We have to do a certain amount of gym every day. Like, all these different things. And you're still here, and you're still smiling. Like, how? Um, I love my kids so much. They mean the world to me. And I have always been drawn to kids who are told they're not going to be successful. And not in my organization, but like in the school. Like, is it really worth putting them in the school? Yes, it is. It is worth putting them in the school. Is it worth spending time? Like, they're not really good at no, you do. They do deserve time. Absolutely, they deserve time. They are owed your time. You have a responsibility to give them your time. I love my kids, my work kids. I absolutely love them. They mean a lot to me. And being a mom, I'm a mom of 3 kids. I feel very protective of my students. And when I go into meetings with the school district, they know those are my kids. Um, so yeah, that's kind of where I am on that.
Yeah, no, it's so humanizing the way you talk about them in their entirety, right? Because you're not thinking of them from a limited stance of like, how are you academic wise, right? As a student, right? But you are laughing with them, people are teasing one another playfully, or kind of recognizing maybe there might be fun times, maybe there'll be like sad times where you have to kind of really sit with trauma together, um, for yourself, right? Kind of learning the arc of their stories and kind of what they've had to go through, knowing kind of the structural components of what does it mean to be in this country, and the demands of that. The word like resilience just came to my mind with how difficult it must be. And like you said, they still, are kids, right? They still laugh and they still, um, you know, show up to school and do their best. And so that relationship that you're speaking of is just really, again, like very close bond, and something that yeah, I really appreciate the strong advocacy of like, no, this is something that they're owed, right? Whatever kind of judgments may be coming from a teacher or administrator or lawyer or whomever, right? We don't know the entirety of their story. We just know that, they're in our care, and that they're doing the best that they can. So why should you give less than the best that you can offer, right? And I think that kind of
Absolutely.
mentality is very powerful and oftentimes missing, right? When we think about like kind of organizations and their capacity maybe, or their own sense, like their perceived capacity of like what can we offer, when like it's gonna take everyone's efforts, and yeah, yeah, I just was like, the way you were sharing, I was like, wow, that's so amazing. And then it made me think about my students, um, and how I always try to like kind of show up and be my authentic self, and that, yeah, I'm not like perfect. No one's perfect, but there's times where like, things can be difficult in your life too. And, to be honest, to have that level of honesty and just demonstrate that, I think is really refreshing actually for a lot of these students who probably see they're exposed to a lot of different personalities throughout the system of like people who are completely broken down or people who put up the kind of facade. And so yeah, that's something that was kind of coming to my mind. But I wanted to ask another question, just as kind of looking at the time, we are going to start wrapping things up,
Yeah.
unfortunately. But yeah,
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate you making this time and sharing your incredible background. And I feel like we've been able to cover a lot in a relatively short conversation. Um, and we are coming to the home stretch, of
Oh,
our
nice, nice.
conversation. Yeah, keeping in line with that theme of coming home. And is there any kind of like suggestion, recommendation that you might have? Maybe a book, movie, recommendation that you think resonates with our conversation, or something that you just feel like really passionate about that you just want the listeners to know, and have on their radar. So yeah, any thoughts?
I love the book series, Indigenous Peoples Perspective of American History. They have it for Indigenous people, they have it for the Black perspective, the Latino perspective, and it really contextualizes the U.S. history, like what, it wasn't all roses and flowers. And so I think it's important to like have that context, especially even like if you're not a history teacher, just like working with BIPOC and underserved communities. like having this context of what it means to be a student in the United States with all this, not, I don't want to say bad, but this complex history, because it is a part of your everyday life. Um, so I think that's very important. And then just like making sure you have like visuals and literacy and like representation of different cultures. Like we're talking about role models, it doesn't always have to be Martin Luther King. Like we can go beyond that. Like we can do a little bit of research and a little bit of digging to find other things. You know, if we're talking about indigenous people, we always got to talk about Sacagawea. Like we can go beyond that. We can dig a little deeper. So I think that's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, definitely. Especially since I actually happen to be teaching US history for the first time this year.
Oh,
I need to take note, careful note. So I will be looking into that book. Thank you so much. And
all right. Well,
yeah, and this has been so wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing with such passion about the work that you're doing, and then also equally important your own journey and how it's not been smooth sailing, but actually much of that trauma and hardship that you experience and the questioning of who you are has made you into the kind of person that is able to advocate, right? The perfect person to advocate for the students that you're serving. So I'm just really happy and that you're in that capacity and that your students are so fortunate to be with you, and likewise that you're very fortunate to be with those students. So any just to kind of close off our conversation, any like final thoughts or any kind of like send off that you'd like to kind of just conclude our conversation today?
I mean, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have spoken with you and to kind of like have this open dialogue was very healing, honestly, very therapeutic and calming. So, thank you for like providing the space to have this conversation.